I pulled into my grandmother Dorothy's circular driveway in my rusted Honda Civic, my entire life stuffed into a worn backpack on the passenger seat. The Connecticut estate looked magnificent as always, with its towering oak trees and manicured gardens, but I felt like a fraud walking up those marble steps. 3 weeks of sleeping in my car had left me exhausted and desperate. As our family gathered around the dining room table, Dorothy suddenly slammed her wine glass down and screamed at me across the turkey centerpiece. "Why is an elderly couple living in the $1 million vacation home I bought for you?" I froze completely, my mind blank with confusion, and stammered back, "What are you talking about? I'm homeless right now." At that exact moment, my sister Sarah turned pale as fresh snow, and the doorbell rang with unexpected urgency. The mahogany front door swung open to reveal Marcus Thompson, a distinguished attorney from Pemberton and Associates, clutching a leather briefcase that looked more expensive than my car. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled despite the November wind, and his navy suit suggested serious legal business that couldn't wait until Monday morning. "Mr. Abram Collins," Marcus asked, scanning the bewildered faces around our formal dining table. "I've been attempting to reach you for months regarding significant property tax discrepancies on your Hampton residence." My stomach dropped as 20 pairs of family eyes turned toward me with growing suspicion. Uncle Robert set down his fork with a metallic clank against the china, while my cousins whispered among themselves near the cranberry sauce. Dorothy's face shifted from confusion to protective concern as she gestured for Marcus to join our gathering. "I think there's been some mistake." I managed my voice cracking slightly. "I don't own any property anywhere, let alone in the Hamptons." Marcus opened his briefcase with practiced efficiency, spreading documents across Dorothy's polished table like evidence at a crime scene. The papers were official, intimidating, and covered with legal stamps that made my head spin. Property deeds, mortgage agreements, insurance policies, and bank statements created a paper trail that seemed to prove the impossible. "According to Nassau County records, you purchased a $1,200,000 beachfront property 18 months ago." Marcus explained, pointing to a deed with my name printed in bold letters. "The down payment of $300,000 came from a wire transfer traced to Mrs. Dorothy Collins, and monthly mortgage payments of $4,200 have been automatically withdrawn from a Chase bank account opened in your name." Dorothy leaned forward, her reading glasses sliding down her nose as she examined the paperwork. "I did wire that money," she confirmed slowly, her voice filled with growing bewilderment. "Abram called me last spring saying he'd found the perfect investment property and needed help with the down payment. He promised to pay me back within 2 years. Grandmother. I never called you about any property." I protested, feeling panic rise in my chest like floodwater. "I've been homeless since October. I lost my apartment when I couldn't make rent." Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair, avoiding eye contact as she picked at her mashed potatoes. Her usual confident demeanor had cracked, replaced by nervous energy that made her fingers tremble around her water glass. Something about her behavior triggered alarm bells in my mind, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what felt wrong. Marcus continued his methodical presentation, producing bank statements that showed regular deposits and withdrawals from an account I'd never seen before. The signature cards matched my handwriting perfectly, down to the distinctive loop in my letter A and the way I crossed my T's. Every document looked legitimate, official, and utterly impossible. "The property generates rental income of $3,200 monthly from elderly tenants who've been residing there since March," Marcus added, consulting his notes. "However, property taxes haven't been paid in 6 months, and the county is threatening foreclosure proceedings." My cousin Bradley suddenly spoke up from across the table, his real estate experience making him particularly interested in the conversation. "I actually helped coordinate some of the paperwork for that transaction," he admitted, causing everyone to turn toward him with surprise. "Sarah contacted me last year saying Abram was too overwhelmed with personal issues to handle the details himself." Sarah. Dorothy's voice carried a sharp edge as she focused on my sister with laser-like intensity. What exactly was your involvement in this purchase? Sarah's face flushed crimson as she fumbled for words, her composure completely shattered. I was just helping Abram with some administrative tasks, she mumbled, still refusing to meet anyone's gaze. He was going through a difficult period and asked me to assist with correspondence. Marcus pulled out another folder, this one containing email communications that made my blood run cold. Dozens of messages between Sarah's personal email address and the real estate office showed detailed negotiations, property inspections, and closing arrangements spanning several months. Every email was signed with my name, but the writing style and level of real estate knowledge displayed were completely foreign to me. The email trail shows extensive communication between your assistant and our office, Marcus explained, gesturing toward Sarah. All major decisions were made through these electronic exchanges, with your sister acting as your representative throughout the entire purchase process. The dining room fell silent except for the grandfather clock ticking in the corner and the sound of my heart pounding against my ribs. Everything about this situation felt surreal, like watching someone else's life unfold in fast forward. The evidence was overwhelming. The signatures were mine, and yet I had absolutely zero memory of any aspect of this property purchase. Dorothy removed her glasses and rubbed her temples, processing the implications of what we'd just discovered. If Abram owns this property and has been collecting rental income, why is he sleeping in his car? She asked slowly, voicing the question that hung heavy in the autumn air. Marcus shuffled through his papers one more time, pulling out phone records that revealed the final piece of this confusing puzzle. According to cellular company records, dozens of calls were placed from Sarah's phone number to our office during the negotiation and closing process. The conversations were lengthy and detailed, suggesting intimate knowledge of the transaction that seems inconsistent with mere administrative assistance. Sarah's water glass slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering against Dorothy's marble floor with a crash that made everyone jump. As she knelt to clean up the broken pieces, tears began streaming down her cheeks, and I realized that my sister was hiding something far more significant than simple paperwork assistance. The room erupted into confused conversations as family members tried to process this revelation, but all I could think about was one terrifying question. If I owned $1 million property and had been collecting rent for months, where was all that money and why was I homeless? Sarah remained on the floor longer than necessary, collecting glass fragments with shaking hands while tears dripped onto Dorothy's Persian rug. When she finally stood up, her mascara had created dark streaks down her cheeks, and her carefully styled blonde hair hung limp around her shoulders like a curtain of shame. "I need to tell everyone something," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of family conversations. "But it's complicated, and I'm afraid you'll all hate me." Uncle Robert leaned back in his antique chair, his accountant instincts clearly triggered by the financial irregularities we'd uncovered. Sarah, if you know something about this property situation, you need to speak up right now. Abram's credit and legal standing could be seriously damaged by whatever's happening here. Dorothy set her coffee cup down with deliberate control, the kind of measured movement that suggested barely contained fury. "Young lady, if you've been involved in some scheme that's left my grandson homeless while someone else lives in property I paid for, you'll explain yourself immediately." Sarah collapsed back into her chair, burying her face in her hands as sobs racked her entire body. The transformation from composed family gathering to crisis intervention felt jarring and surreal, like watching a peaceful lake suddenly develop dangerous rapids. "I have keys to the Hampton house," Sarah finally admitted through her tears. "I've been managing the rental situation because Abram was in such bad shape last year. He signed paperwork giving me power of attorney when he was having his breakdown after losing his job." My mind reeled as memories of my darkest period came flooding back. 18 months ago, I'd been laid off from my position as a software developer when my startup company collapsed overnight. The combination of job loss, relationship breakup, and mounting debt had sent me into a spiral of depression that lasted for months. I'd barely been able to get out of bed, let alone handle complex financial decisions. I remember signing some documents. I said slowly, pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a disturbing picture. You said they were for temporary financial management while I got back on my feet, but I thought that arrangement ended when I started feeling better. Sarah shook her head vigorously, pulling crumpled papers from her purse with trembling fingers. These power of attorney documents are still valid, she insisted, showing us official-looking forms with notary stamps and legal language. I've been collecting the rental income and managing all the property expenses on your behalf. Marcus examined the power of attorney paperwork with professional scrutiny, his expression growing increasingly troubled as he read the fine print. These documents do appear legitimate, he confirmed, but they raise significant questions about financial management and accountability. Dorothy stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a harsh sound that made everyone wince. Sarah, if you've been collecting rental income on Abram's behalf, where is that money? My grandson has been sleeping in his car for 3 weeks while tenants pay rent on property I helped purchase. I've been depositing the checks into a separate account for safekeeping. Sarah explained weakly, her story becoming more convoluted with each revelation. There have been expenses for maintenance and repairs that needed to be covered before any profits could be distributed. Uncle Robert's expertise in financial matters made him particularly skeptical of Sarah's explanation. Rental income of $3,200 monthly for 8 months should total approximately $25,000, he calculated aloud. Even with reasonable property expenses, there should be significant funds available for distribution. Sarah's composure cracked completely as she realized her family was performing real-time financial analysis of her management decisions. The tenants Harold and Betty Martinez have been wonderful, she said desperately, trying to redirect the conversation. They're elderly and retired, and they've taken excellent care of the property. Have you actually visited these tenants? Dorothy demanded, her grandmother instincts now fully activated in protective mode. Do you have documentation of all these supposed expenses you've been managing? The silence that followed Dorothy's question stretched uncomfortably, long broken only by the sound of Sarah's increasingly labored breathing. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet we had to strain to hear her confession. I borrowed against my own house to cover some temporary financial difficulties. Sarah admitted the words, tumbling out in a rush of panic. David and I were facing foreclosure, and I thought I could use the rental income temporarily and pay it back before anyone noticed. The dining room erupted as family members processed this admission. My cousin Bradley looked stricken, realizing his professional assistance had enabled Sarah's scheme. Dorothy's face cycled through expressions of shock, disappointment, and growing rage as the full scope of her granddaughter's deception became clear. How much money have you taken? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt inside. The betrayal cut deeper than the financial loss, knowing that my sister had exploited my mental health crisis for her own desperate purposes. Sarah's answer came out as barely a whisper. $47,000 in rental income, plus I've been charging Harold and Betty separate utility payments that were actually included in the mortgage. Marcus made careful notes as Sarah's confession continued, documenting each admission for potential legal proceedings. The elderly tenants were being overcharged, my credit was being damaged by irregular mortgage payments, and property taxes remained unpaid despite months of rental income collection. The worst part, Sarah continued, her voice breaking completely, is that I made a rubber stamp of Abram's signature from his old employment paperwork. I've been endorsing checks and signing documents in his name for over a year. The room fell deadly silent as everyone processed the implications of systematic forgery and identity theft. Dorothy slowly sat back down, her face pale with shock as she realized her financial assistance had enabled a complex fraud operation, targeting both her grandson and innocent elderly tenants. Sarah, Dorothy said with barely controlled fury, you've committed multiple felonies while exploiting your brother's mental health crisis and stealing from elderly people. The only question now is whether we handle this as a family matter or involve law enforcement. As Sarah dissolved into hysterical sobs, I realized that my sister's betrayal extended far beyond simple financial desperation into calculated criminal behavior that had lasted for over a year. The magnitude of her deception was staggering, and I wondered how many other victims might be affected by schemes I didn't even know about yet. Marcus Thompson pulled out his cell phone with professional efficiency, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number for Harold and Betty Martinez. "I think it's crucial that we speak directly with your tenants," he explained to our shell-shocked family gathering. "They deserve to understand what's been happening with their housing situation." The phone rang 3 times before a warm, slightly gravelly voice answered. "Hello, this is Harold Martinez speaking." "Mr. Martinez, this is Marcus Thompson from Pemberton and Associates. I'm here with Abram Collins, the actual owner of the property you've been renting. We need to discuss some urgent matters regarding your tenancy agreement." There was a pause followed by the sound of Harold calling to his wife. "Betty, come to the phone. It's about the house situation we've been discussing." Within minutes, Harold and Betty had agreed to drive the 45 minutes from their Hampton rental to Dorothy's Connecticut estate. Their willingness to travel on Thanksgiving evening spoke to their concern about the confusing signals they'd been receiving about their housing arrangement. While we waited for their arrival, Sarah's emotional breakdown continued in the guest bathroom where Dorothy had sent her to compose herself and prepare for a difficult conversation. The rest of our family sat in uncomfortable silence, picking at cold turkey while processing the criminal implications of what we'd discovered. "I feel like an idiot," Bradley admitted, running his hands through his dark hair with obvious distress. "Sarah told me Abram was overseas with military deployment and needed help managing stateside property investments. I never questioned why all communication went through her instead of directly with my cousin." Dorothy poured herself a generous glass of wine, her usual Thanksgiving composure completely abandoned. "We've all been manipulated by someone we trusted implicitly," she said, her voice carrying decades of family disappointment. "The question now is how to minimize damage to innocent people while ensuring appropriate consequences for criminal behavior." When Harold and Betty Martinez arrived, their appearance immediately evoked sympathy and concern from everyone present. Harold walked with a slight limp, using a wooden cane carved with military insignia, while Betty moved carefully beside him, her silver hair neatly arranged despite the late-hour emergency summons. "Mr. Collins." Harold extended his weathered hand toward me with genuine warmth. "We've been hoping to meet you for months. Sarah always said you were too busy with military duties to visit the property, but we've been taking excellent care of your beautiful home." The misunderstanding hit me like physical pain. These elderly people had been living under completely false pretenses, believing I was serving overseas while Sarah collected their money and lied about my circumstances. "Please, sit down." Dorothy offered, guiding Harold and Betty to comfortable chairs near the fireplace. "There's been a significant misunderstanding about the property arrangement, and we need to clarify several important details." Betty opened a well-organized folder filled with receipts, photographs, and handwritten notes. "We've documented every improvement and repair we've made to the property," she explained proudly. "Sarah assured us that our contributions would reduce the eventual purchase price when we're ready to buy the house." My heart sank as I realized the depth of Sarah's deception extended beyond simple rent collection into false promises about property ownership transfers. These innocent people had been investing their retirement savings based on lies about future purchase opportunities. "Harold and I have been paying $3,200 monthly plus separate charges for electricity, water, and internet service." Betty continued consulting her meticulous records. "We've also invested $38,000 in property improvements, including a new roof, updated HVAC system, and bathroom renovations." Marcus took careful notes as Betty detailed their financial investment in property they would never own. The scope of Sarah's deception was expanding beyond anything I'd imagined, encompassing not just rental fraud but systematic exploitation of elderly people's retirement security. "We chose this location specifically because it's only 12 minutes from the VA hospital," Harold explained, his military bearing evident despite his physical limitations. I have ongoing medical treatments, and Betty researched the area extensively before we committed to the rental agreement. Dorothy's expression softened as she listened to Harold's health concerns and their careful planning for retirement housing. What exactly did Sarah tell you about the property ownership situation and your future purchase options? She asked gently. She said you were deployed overseas indefinitely, Betty replied, and that you'd specifically requested elderly tenants because you appreciated responsible, quiet occupants who would maintain the property well. She promised us first right of refusal to purchase for $800,000, which we've been saving toward for the past 8 months. The number hit me like a sledgehammer. Sarah had been collecting $3,200 in monthly rent while promising these people they could eventually buy the property for $200,000 less than its actual market value. Every aspect of their arrangement was built on fabricated information designed to extract maximum money from vulnerable retirees. Harold, Betty. I began carefully struggling to find words that wouldn't devastate these kind people. I've never been in the military. I don't live overseas, and until today I had no knowledge of your existence or the rental arrangement. My sister has been managing this situation without my knowledge or consent. The color drained from Harold's weathered face as he processed my words. Betty's hand flew to her chest, and she looked between Harold and me with growing alarm. Are you saying, Harold asked slowly, that our rental payments and property improvements have been made under false pretenses? That Sarah doesn't actually represent your interests or have authority to make purchase promises? Marcus intervened with professional compassion. Mr. and Mrs. Martinez, it appears you've been the victims of a complex fraud operation. However, we're committed to finding solutions that protect your housing security and financial investments. Betty began crying softly, not from anger, but from fear about their uncertain future. We sold our previous home and used most of our savings for the security deposit and improvements, she whispered. We thought we were building equity toward ownership of our retirement home. Harold put his arm around his wife's shoulders, his military training helping him maintain composure despite the devastating news. What are our legal options? He asked directly. Are we protected as tenants, or will we lose our home and all our financial investments? The question hung in the air like smoke, highlighting the human cost of Sarah's criminal behavior. These weren't abstract victims in a financial crime. They were real people whose retirement security had been deliberately exploited by someone they trusted. Dorothy stood up with renewed determination, her protective instincts now extending beyond her immediate family to include Harold and Betty. You will not lose your home or your investments, she declared firmly. Whatever legal measures are necessary to protect you and compensate you for this deception will ensure they're implemented immediately. As I looked at Harold and Betty's trusting faces, I realized that Sarah's betrayal extended far beyond stealing from family. She had systematically exploited elderly people's vulnerability, and I was now responsible for ensuring they received both justice and protection from further harm. Dorothy immediately contacted her personal attorney, followed by a private investigator she'd used previously for business matters. Within 2 hours of Harold and Betty's departure, our Thanksgiving gathering had transformed into a crisis management center, with laptops, legal documents, and financial records scattered across every available surface. Linda Chen, the private investigator, arrived at midnight with laptop computers and forensic accounting software that could trace complex financial transactions across multiple institutions. Her reputation for thoroughness had earned her contracts with major corporations investigating internal fraud, and she approached Sarah's deception with methodical precision. Identity theft and elder fraud cases require comprehensive investigation, because perpetrators rarely limit themselves to single incidents. Linda explained setting up her equipment on Dorothy's dining room table. If your sister has been forging signatures and manipulating elderly tenants, there are likely additional victims we haven't discovered yet. Sarah had finally emerged from the bathroom, her face puffy and tear-streaked, but her demeanor had shifted from remorseful to defensive. "You're all making this sound worse than it actually is," she protested weakly. I was trying to help Abram recover from his depression while solving my own temporary financial crisis. Linda's initial computer searches immediately revealed disturbing patterns that contradicted Sarah's claims about isolated desperation. Bank records showed systematic deposits from multiple sources suggesting rental income from properties beyond the Hampton house we'd already discovered. Sarah. These financial records show rental deposits from at least 3 different sources over the past 18 months. Linda announced, her tone remaining professionally neutral despite the implications. Care to explain the additional income streams listed under your business account? Sarah's defensive facade cracked as she realized the scope of Linda's investigative capabilities. There might be a couple other small arrangements, she admitted reluctantly, but nothing as significant as the Hampton property. Uncle Robert, whose accounting background made him valuable in analyzing the financial evidence, discovered that Sarah had created multiple fictitious business entities to launder the rental income and avoid tax reporting requirements. She's been operating as Coastal Property Management, Atlantic Rental Services, and Northeast Housing Solutions, he announced grimly. Dorothy's wineglass trembled in her hand as the magnitude of Sarah's criminal operation became clear. "How many elderly couples have you been exploiting?" she demanded, her voice carrying the full authority of family matriarch confronting ultimate betrayal. Linda's computer analysis revealed credit applications, mortgage documents, and rental agreements spanning multiple states, all bearing forged signatures that appeared to be mine. The systematic nature of the fraud suggested months of planning and execution that went far beyond desperate measures to avoid foreclosure. The pattern indicates at least 6 separate properties across Connecticut, New York, and Massachusetts. Linda reported, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she traced interconnected financial transactions. Total rental income appears to exceed $200,000 annually. My head spun as I tried to process the scale of Sarah's operation. While I'd been struggling with homelessness and depression, she'd been running a sophisticated fraud network that generated more income than most people's legitimate careers. "Sarah," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me, "you haven't just stolen from me or exploited elderly people. You've built an entire criminal enterprise using my identity while watching me sleep in my car." Sarah's husband David arrived unexpectedly, having driven from their home after receiving frantic phone calls about family emergencies. His confusion turned to horror as Marcus explained the evening's revelations about systematic fraud and identity theft. "I thought Sarah inherited money from Dorothy," David said slowly, his face pale with shock. "She told me her grandmother had given her a substantial gift to help with our mortgage problems. I never questioned where the money was actually coming from." Linda's investigation continued throughout the night, revealing that Sarah had been monitoring my credit reports and social media accounts to ensure I remained unaware of the properties and financial activity conducted in my name. She'd even intercepted mail from financial institutions to prevent me from discovering accounts and transactions I never authorized. The level of sophisticated planning suggests this wasn't desperate improvisation, Linda explained to our exhausted group. "Your sister has been operating a deliberate criminal enterprise designed to exploit both your identity and vulnerable elderly populations." As dawn broke over Connecticut, Sarah's deception had grown from simple theft into a complex fraud operation affecting dozens of innocent victims across multiple states. Her gambling addiction had provided motivation, but the systematic nature of her crimes revealed calculated criminal behavior that extended far beyond family betrayal. "The most disturbing discovery," Linda announced as she compiled her preliminary report, "is evidence that Sarah researched deceased individuals' estate records to perfect her fraud techniques. Her methods show she learned from probate documents how to exploit elderly people's trust and financial vulnerability." Dorothy sat in stunned silence as she processed the realization that her granddaughter had become a sophisticated criminal who studied death records to improve her ability to exploit living elderly victims. The betrayal had evolved beyond family dysfunction into genuine evil that threatened innocent people's life savings and housing security. "We need to contact law enforcement immediately," Marcus advised organizing the evidence Linda had compiled throughout the night. The scope and sophistication of this operation requires federal investigation for interstate fraud and systematic identity theft. Sarah's final defense collapsed as she realized the overwhelming evidence made denial impossible. "I never meant for it to get this complicated," she sobbed, but her words sounded hollow against the backdrop of systematic criminal behavior that had destroyed multiple families' financial security. As I looked around Dorothy's dining room at the evidence of my sister's elaborate criminal enterprise, I realized that pursuing justice wasn't just about recovering my stolen identity. Dozens of elderly couples across 3 states needed protection from someone who had turned exploiting vulnerable people into a profitable business model. The decision to cooperate fully with law enforcement felt overwhelming but necessary. Sarah's crimes extended far beyond family betrayal into systematic predation that required criminal prosecution to protect current and future victims from continued exploitation. Detective Angela Rodriguez from the Connecticut State Police Financial Crimes Unit arrived at Dorothy's estate early Friday morning, bringing federal agents from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. The transformation of our family Thanksgiving into a major criminal investigation felt surreal, but the evidence Linda had compiled overnight demanded serious law enforcement response. "Mr. Collins," Detective Rodriguez addressed me with professional compassion. "Identity theft cases of this magnitude typically involve organized criminal networks. Your sister's operation shows sophisticated planning that suggests she may have additional accomplices beyond your cousin Bradley." Sarah sat rigid in Dorothy's living room, flanked by the attorney David had hired during the early morning hours. Her demeanor had shifted again from remorseful to calculating, as if she'd spent the night strategizing how to minimize her legal exposure. "I want full immunity from prosecution in exchange for complete cooperation," Sarah announced through her attorney, shocking everyone with her continued attempts to negotiate from a position of criminal culpability. Dorothy's reaction was swift and decisive. "You'll receive no support, financial or otherwise, from this family unless you provide complete restitution to every victim and accept full criminal responsibility for your actions." Detective Rodriguez spread crime scene photos across the coffee table showing apartments and homes where elderly couples had been systematically defrauded of their life savings. "These are real people whose retirement security you've destroyed," she said, forcing Sarah to confront the human cost of her criminal enterprise. "Mrs. Martinez called our office this morning," Detective Rodriguez continued, reporting that they've discovered other elderly couples in similar situations throughout their community. "Your sister's reputation for helping seniors find affordable housing has spread through retirement communities across 3 states." The scope of victimization continued expanding as federal agents traced Sarah's network through social media, church groups, and senior centers where she'd cultivated relationships specifically to identify vulnerable targets. Her methods showed sophisticated understanding of elderly psychology and financial planning that made her particularly effective at gaining trust. "How many families have lost their homes because of you?" I demanded, facing Sarah directly for the first time since the crisis began. "How many elderly couples are homeless right now because you stole their security deposits and rental payments?" Sarah's attorney advised her not to answer, but her composure finally cracked under the weight of specific accusations about displaced elderly victims. "I kept detailed records of everyone," she admitted quietly. "I can provide complete financial documentation for restitution purposes." Marcus had been working throughout the night with federal prosecutors to structure plea agreements that prioritized victim compensation over lengthy imprisonment. "The government is willing to consider reduced sentencing if your client provides complete cooperation and agrees to supervised restitution payments for all identified victims. I want to see those records now." Dorothy demanded, her protective instincts now extending to every elderly victim of Sarah's schemes. "No one else will lose their home because of this family's failures." Sarah directed federal agents to a storage unit where she'd maintained meticulous files on every property tenant and financial transaction, spanning 3 years of criminal activity. The organization and detail of her records revealed someone who'd planned her criminal enterprise with business-like efficiency. The storage unit contains documentation on 43 separate fraud incidents, Detective Rodriguez reported after agents completed their initial search. Total estimated victim losses exceed $800,000 when including security deposits, rental payments, and property improvements. The number hit our family like a physical blow. Sarah hadn't just committed crimes, she'd operated a sophisticated business model based entirely on exploiting elderly people's trust and financial vulnerability. I need to speak with every victim personally, I declared, realizing that my stolen identity had been used to destroy dozens of families' financial security. They deserve direct apologies and assurance that restitution will be prioritized above everything else. Dorothy immediately committed her entire liquid assets toward victim compensation, while Marcus began structuring legal mechanisms to ensure every elderly couple received full financial recovery, regardless of Sarah's ability to pay restitution from prison. The federal investigation will continue for months, Detective Rodriguez explained, but we can begin victim outreach immediately to provide emergency housing assistance and financial counseling for displaced families. Sarah's husband David filed for divorce that afternoon, seeking emergency custody of their children to protect them from the criminal proceedings and media attention surrounding the fraud investigation. His decision to cooperate fully with prosecutors demonstrated his commitment to victim restitution over family loyalty. Bradley faced immediate suspension of his real estate license pending investigation into his role as an accomplice in property fraud schemes. His professional reputation and career would never recover from association with systematic elder abuse, regardless of his claim about being manipulated by Sarah's lies. The most disturbing aspect, Federal Prosecutor James Mitchell explained during our evening briefing, is evidence that your sister was recruiting other family members to expand her operation into additional states. She'd identified cousins and relatives who could serve as fronts for similar fraud networks. The revelation that Sarah had been planning to involve additional family members in criminal enterprises targeting elderly victims across the entire Northeast region made her prosecution a federal priority for preventing organized fraud expansion. As the weekend progressed, Harold and Betty Martinez became unofficial advocates for other elderly victims using their military connections and senior community networks to identify additional families who'd been defrauded by Sarah's various business entities. We're not just victims, Harold announced during a conference call with federal investigators. We're survivors who can help other families recover their dignity and financial security from this criminal operation. Their transformation from victims to advocates provided hope that something positive could emerge from the devastating betrayal that had destroyed so many families' retirement plans and housing security. Sarah's operation is being dismantled systematically. Detective Rodriguez assured our family, but the recovery process for elderly victims will require ongoing support and advocacy to ensure complete financial and emotional restoration. The path forward required balancing justice for criminal behavior with compassionate assistance for innocent victims, whose only mistake was trusting someone who presented herself as a helpful housing advocate for senior citizens. 6 months after that devastating Thanksgiving confrontation, I stood in federal court watching Sarah receive her sentencing for interstate fraud, elder abuse, and systematic identity theft. The judge's words carried the weight of 43 families suffering as he imposed 4 years in federal prison, plus mandatory restitution totaling nearly $1 million. Mrs. Patterson, Judge William Morrison addressed Sarah using her married name, "Your crimes represent calculated exploitation of society's most vulnerable members. The elderly couples you defrauded trusted you with their life savings and retirement security, believing you were helping them achieve housing stability." Sarah's transformation during 6 months of federal investigation had been remarkable to witness. The sophisticated criminal who'd operated fraud networks across 3 states had become a hollow shell of her former self, medicated for anxiety and depression while facing the complete destruction of her marriage, family relationships, and freedom. Detective Angela Rodriguez had become more than just the investigating officer. Her dedication to victim advocacy and systematic approach to financial recovery had created a model for elder fraud prosecutions nationwide. Her personal attention to each elderly couple's story had provided both emotional support and practical assistance during the recovery process. The restitution payments will be structured to prioritize emergency housing assistance and medical care for elderly victims. Judge Morrison explained outlining a supervised payment plan that would continue even after Sarah's release from federal prison. Harold and Betty Martinez sat in the courtroom's front row, having become the unofficial representatives for all 43 victimized families. Their military bearing and dignity had inspired other elderly couples to speak publicly about their experiences and advocate for stronger consumer protections. Your Honor, Harold addressed the court during victim impact statements. Mrs. Patterson didn't just steal our money. She stole our faith in human kindness and made us question our ability to make sound decisions about our own lives. Betty's testimony was equally powerful, describing how Sarah's deception had forced them to doubt their mental competence and consider whether age had made them too vulnerable to live independently. The psychological damage extended beyond financial loss into fundamental questions about dignity and autonomy. Dorothy had established the Collins Foundation for Elder Protection, using her substantial personal wealth to provide emergency housing assistance, legal advocacy, and financial counseling for seniors victimized by housing fraud. Her guilt about enabling Sarah's initial crimes had transformed into passionate advocacy for systematic change. Every elderly person deserves safe, affordable housing without fear of exploitation. Dorothy testified before Congress about the need for stronger federal protections against senior housing fraud. My family's failure to recognize criminal behavior within our own ranks demonstrates how easily trusted individuals can exploit institutional vulnerability. The Hampton house had become a symbol of redemption rather than crime. Harold and Betty were now legitimate tenants with proper lease agreements and legal protections, while the property's equity appreciation helped fund Dorothy's foundation for other elderly victims. Living in this beautiful home feels different now, Betty explained during a media interview about elder fraud recovery. We're not just survivors of a crime. We're advocates helping other families avoid similar exploitation. My relationship with Detective Angela Rodriguez had evolved from professional to personal as we worked together on victim advocacy initiatives. Her combination of law enforcement experience and genuine compassion for elderly victims had created a partnership that extended beyond the criminal case into ongoing community protection efforts. Angela and I are developing educational programs for senior communities. I explained to a reporter covering the sentencing hearing. Elderly people need practical tools for recognizing and reporting housing fraud before they lose their life savings. The nonprofit organization I'd founded, Safe Housing for Seniors, had grown rapidly as more families shared their experiences with sophisticated fraud schemes targeting retirement communities. Federal funding and private donations had enabled expansion into 12 states where organized criminal networks preyed on elderly housing insecurity. Abram's personal experience with identity theft gives him unique credibility when speaking with elderly audiences, explained Maria Santos, the program coordinator for our fraud prevention workshops. Seniors trust his message because he understands both the criminal methods and the emotional impact of financial exploitation. Bradley's professional recovery had been slow but steady. After losing his real estate license and serving community service, he'd retrained as a housing advocate specializing in senior protection services. His intimate knowledge of real estate fraud techniques made him valuable for identifying and preventing similar schemes. I spend every day trying to atone for my role in enabling Sarah's crimes, Bradley admitted during his victim impact statement. The families I helped defraud deserve better advocacy than I provided when they trusted me with their housing security. David's divorce had been finalized with primary custody arrangements that protected his children from ongoing criminal proceedings and media attention. His complete cooperation with federal investigators had helped trace additional fraud networks and recover assets for victim restitution. My children will grow up understanding that family loyalty never justifies enabling criminal behavior, David explained to the judge during character testimony. Supporting Abram's victim advocacy work helps demonstrate positive values after their mother's criminal choices. Sarah's imprisonment marked the beginning of recovery rather than the end of consequences. Federal investigators continued tracing her network's connections to other fraud operations, identifying criminal associates and additional victims throughout the Northeast region. This case has exposed systematic vulnerabilities in senior housing protections, Prosecutor James Mitchell announced after sentencing. Mrs. Patterson's methods are being studied to develop better consumer safeguards and law enforcement training programs. The transformation of our family crisis into national advocacy for elder protection felt overwhelming but necessary. Sarah's crimes had destroyed dozens of families' retirement security, but the recovery efforts had created lasting changes in how society protects vulnerable elderly populations from housing fraud. Every elderly couple deserves the dignity and security that Harold and Betty have found. I reflected while watching the news coverage of Sarah's sentencing. Their transformation from victims to advocates proves that recovery is possible with proper support and systematic change. The courtroom emptied slowly as families processed the emotional conclusion to 18 months of federal investigation and legal proceedings. Justice had been served, but the real work of rebuilding trust and protecting future elderly victims from similar exploitation was just beginning. 2 years have passed since that shocking Thanksgiving confrontation that exposed Sarah's criminal enterprise and changed the trajectory of my entire life. Standing before 300 senior citizens at the National Conference on Elder Financial Protection, I reflected on how complete devastation had transformed into purposeful advocacy that now protects thousands of elderly families from housing fraud. My sister's betrayal taught me that identity theft isn't just about stolen credit cards or unauthorized purchases. I explained to the engaged audience of retirees' family members and social service professionals. When someone steals your identity to exploit vulnerable elderly people, the damage extends far beyond personal financial loss into systematic destruction of community trust. Harold and Betty Martinez sat proudly in the front row, having become the conference's keynote speakers about elderly resilience and recovery from financial exploitation. Their journey from bewildered victims to national advocates had inspired federal legislation strengthening consumer protections for senior housing arrangements. Harold and Betty didn't just survive Sarah's fraud. I continued gesturing toward my dear friends whose courage had helped dozens of other families find justice. They transformed their experience into a nationwide movement that's prevented thousands of elderly couples from losing their life savings to similar criminal schemes. Angela Rodriguez, now, my wife of 14 months, coordinated the conference's law enforcement training sessions, where police officers learned specialized techniques for investigating elder fraud cases. Her expertise in financial crimes had earned her promotion to supervise a federal task force dedicated exclusively to protecting senior citizens from systematic exploitation. The Safe Housing for Seniors organization has documented over 2,000 attempted fraud cases in the past 18 months, Angela reported during her presentation to law enforcement professionals. Early intervention and rapid response protocols have prevented an estimated $12 million in elderly victim losses. Dorothy's foundation had grown into a major source of emergency assistance for displaced elderly families, while her congressional testimony had influenced federal legislation requiring background checks and licensing for senior housing advocates. Her transformation from enabling grandmother to protective activist had created lasting change in how families recognize and respond to criminal behavior within trusted relationships. My grandmother's guilt about providing the initial funding for Sarah's crimes motivated her to become one of the nation's most effective advocates for elder protection. I shared with the audience. Her foundation has helped over 400 elderly families recover from housing fraud while establishing permanent safeguards against future exploitation. The Hampton House had become headquarters for our nonprofit organization, with Harold and Betty serving as resident coordinators for the victim assistance programs. Their daily presence provided comfort and credibility for newly victimized elderly couples who needed to see tangible examples of successful recovery and restoration. Living in the house that was supposed to represent our exploitation has become a source of empowerment. Betty explained during her workshop about emotional recovery from financial fraud. Every day we spend here helping other families proves that criminals cannot destroy the human spirit or community solidarity. Sarah's continued imprisonment provided necessary consequences for her systematic crimes, while allowing her victims to rebuild their lives without fear of ongoing exploitation. Her required restitution payments had enabled complete financial recovery for most families, though. The emotional healing process continued, requiring specialized counseling and peer support. Federal prosecutors estimate that Sarah's criminal network affected over 60 elderly families across 4 states, explained prosecutor James Mitchell, who'd become a regular speaker at our conferences. The comprehensive victim assistance program developed for this case has become the national model for elder fraud recovery initiatives. Bradley's redemption had included specialized training in fraud prevention and victim advocacy, transforming his real estate expertise into a valuable resource for protecting elderly homebuyers from predatory schemes. His personal experience with enabling criminal behavior provided unique insights for educating other professionals about recognizing exploitation warning signs. My cousin Bradley now conducts training seminars for real estate agents, teaching them how to identify and report suspicious transactions that might indicate elder fraud, I announced to the conference audience. His transformation from unwitting accomplice to protective advocate demonstrates that redemption is possible with genuine commitment to making amends. David's new life with his children had included regular volunteering with our organization, providing administrative support and family counseling for relatives of fraud perpetrators. His first-hand experience with discovering criminal behavior in trusted family members helped other families navigate the complex emotions of pursuing justice while maintaining family relationships. The children affected by elder fraud crimes need specialized support to process their complicated feelings about family members who've committed serious crimes, explained Dr. Patricia Williams, our family counseling coordinator. David's participation in our support groups helps other parents address these challenging conversations with age-appropriate honesty and emotional sensitivity. The national media attention surrounding Sarah's case had generated widespread public awareness about sophisticated elder fraud schemes, leading to increased reporting of suspicious activities and earlier intervention to protect potential victims. Educational campaigns in retirement communities had created networks of informed seniors who actively protected each other from criminal targeting. Since our story became public, we've received thousands of letters from elderly couples who recognized similar warning signs in their own housing arrangements, I shared with the conference attendees. Early detection and rapid response have prevented countless families from experiencing the devastation that Harold Betty and 42 other couples endured. My relationship with Angela had provided personal happiness while strengthening our professional partnership in elder protection advocacy. Our upcoming wedding celebration would include many of the elderly couples whose recovery had been supported by our organization, creating a joyful community event that honored resilience and healing. Angela's dedication to justice and victim advocacy made me understand that true love includes working together to protect vulnerable people from exploitation. I reflected during my closing remarks. Our personal happiness is inseparable from our commitment to ensuring that elderly Americans can age with dignity and financial security. The transformation of my homeless desperation into national leadership on elder protection issues had required processing profound betrayal while maintaining hope for positive change. Sarah's criminal enterprise had destroyed my trust in family relationships, while teaching me that genuine security comes from building communities dedicated to protecting society's most vulnerable members. Every elderly person deserves housing arrangements based on honesty, respect, and legal protection, rather than criminal exploitation. I concluded looking out at an audience filled with survivors, advocates, and professionals committed to systematic change. The recovery process requires acknowledging that trusted individuals can become dangerous criminals while building new relationships based on transparency and mutual accountability. As the conference concluded with standing ovations and commitments to expanded elder protection initiatives, I realized that Sarah's betrayal had ultimately led me to discover my life's true purpose. The homeless desperation I'd experienced 2 years earlier had transformed into expertise that now protected thousands of elderly families from similar devastation. The audience began dispersing to continue their advocacy work in communities across the nation, carrying tools and knowledge that would prevent countless elderly families from experiencing the exploitation that had once threatened to destroy my identity and hope for the future. Have you or your family members ever encountered suspicious housing arrangements or financial requests that seemed too good to be true? Share your experiences in the comments below to help other families recognize potential fraud warning signs. Please like this video if our story helped you understand the importance of protecting elderly loved ones from sophisticated scams, and subscribe to our channel for more content about preventing financial exploitation and identity theft. Don't forget to share this video with friends and family members who work with senior citizens or might benefit from learning about elder fraud prevention. Thank you for joining us in building communities that prioritize protection and dignity for elderly Americans, and may your families always find strength in truth and justice during difficult times.